cat brings mice to old woman's porch. Their relationship is truly heartwarming. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. A cool breeze rustled through the trees as Margaret rocked gently in her wooden chair, gazing at the horizon. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over her small front porch, where she sat sipping a cup of chamomile tea. It was the same routine every evening. Watch the world go by, listen to the birds chirp, and feel the gentle warmth on her aging skin. But today, something was different. As Margaret lowered her teacup, her gaze fell upon a small object resting on the wooden steps of her porch. At first, she squinted, unsure of what she was seeing. A small brown lump, motionless. When she leaned forward for a closer look, realization struck. It was a mouse, dead. Her wrinkled hand instinctively reached for her cane, nudging the tiny creature with the tip. It didn't move. A sigh escaped her lips. Living alone in a house surrounded by open fields, it wasn't uncommon for small critters to wander too close. Usually, she found them scurrying around the yard, but never had she seen one left so neatly at her doorstep. Margaret stood up, placing her tea on the side table. She fetched a small dustpan from inside and scooped up the lifeless mouse, carefully dropping it into the trash. A slight shudder ran through her. She wasn't afraid of mice, but the sight of one so still, its little limbs frozen in time, unsettled her. Shrugging it off as an odd occurrence, she returned to her seat and took another sip of tea. The evening rolled on, and as the sky deepened into hues of purple and orange, she let the thought drift from her mind. That was until the next morning. Margaret stepped out onto her porch, inhaling the crisp morning air. The world was still quiet, save for the distant chirping of birds and the occasional rustle of the wind through the tall grass. She stretched her arms, feeling the tightness in her joints ease as she prepared for the slow walk to fetch her mail. Then she saw it. Another mouse. This one lay exactly where the first had been, right on the same wooden step, its tiny tail curled around its limp body. Margaret froze. Coincidence? Perhaps. But twice in a row? That was something else entirely. A rustling sound made her glance to the side. There, near the base of her porch, sat a cat. A tabby, its fur a mix of deep brown and golden stripes. Its sharp green eyes locked onto hers, unblinking. Margaret tightened her grip on the railing. She had seen this cat before, wandering through the neighborhood. It was one of the town's strays, never too close, always lingering just at the edge of her property. She'd never thought much of it, just another creature passing through. But now suspicion crept into her mind. "Did you do this?" she asked aloud, her voice hoarse from disuse. The cat flicked its tail but didn't move. Margaret sighed, shaking her head. Of course, it wouldn't answer. She shuffled toward the small creature and, just as she had done yesterday, scooped the mouse into her dustpan and tossed it away. The cat watched her the entire time. As she stepped back inside, a strange feeling settled in her chest. The next day, it happened again. Margaret didn't even need to look down when she stepped outside. She already knew what would be waiting. Sure enough, there it was. Another small, lifeless gift placed right in the same exact spot. And sitting just a few feet away, eyes gleaming in the morning light, was the cat. She sighed heavily, rubbing her temples. "You're persistent. I'll give you that," she muttered. The cat remained still, its tail twitching as if waiting for some sort of acknowledgement. Margaret exhaled. It had been years since she had a pet. Her late husband had always loved animals, and they'd had a cat when they were younger, an orange tabby named Winston. But after he passed, Margaret had never found the heart to adopt another. The thought of losing something else, of saying goodbye again, was more than she could bear. And yet, here was this stray, bringing her offerings every single morning. She looked down at the mouse again. This time, she didn't immediately throw it away. Instead, she crouched down slowly, ignoring the ache in her knees, and studied it. The cat watched intently, as if waiting for her reaction. Margaret had read once that cats brought their humans gifts, small prey, things they deemed valuable. Some believed it was a sign of affection, while others thought it was a way of teaching their owners how to hunt. But she wasn't this cat's owner. Still, something about the whole situation felt deliberate. Shaking her head, she scooped up the mouse and walked toward the trash can. But before she tossed it away, she hesitated. Instead, she dug a small hole in the dirt near her flower bed and gently placed the mouse inside. The cat's ears perked up. Margaret covered the tiny creature with soil and patted it down. She wasn't sure why she did it. Maybe as a way of acknowledging the gift, or maybe out of respect for the little life that had ended too soon. When she stood back up, the cat was still watching her. "Well," she murmured, brushing the dirt off her hands. "That's that." She turned to head back inside, but just as she reached the porch steps, she felt something brush against her ankle. Startled, she looked down. The cat had moved closer. For the first time, it rubbed against her leg, its striped tail curling slightly around her calf. Margaret stared in surprise. The cat had never come this close before. Tentatively, she reached down and brushed her fingers over its head. The cat didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, it let out a slow, deep purr. Margaret felt something stir in her chest. Something warm, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She swallowed, her throat tight. "Well," she whispered, "I suppose you're not the worst company." The cat sat at her feet, its green eyes meeting hers. For the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel quite so alone. That night, she set a small dish of food on her porch, just in case. Margaret sat by the window that evening, watching the cat through the thin lace curtains. It hadn't touched the food she left. Not yet, at least. Instead, it lounged a few feet from the porch, stretching lazily in the dim glow of the street lamp. She found herself wondering about it more than she expected. Had it always been in the neighborhood? Had it belonged to someone before? Or had it been born astray, learning the ways of survival through instinct alone? Her thoughts drifted as she stirred her tea, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic. The rhythmic sound filled the quiet room, blending with the faint hum of crickets outside. It had been a long time since she had another presence in her life. A long time since someone, had waited for her in the mornings, had acknowledged her existence in the simplest of ways. She sighed, shaking off the thoughts. It was just a cat. A persistent one, perhaps, but still just a cat. And yet, morning came, and Margaret shuffled onto the porch, already knowing what she would find. The mouse was there, but this time something was different. The cat sat closer, much closer than before. It wasn't watching from the base of the porch anymore. It was sitting right beside the step, tail wrapped neatly around its paws, its green eyes locked onto hers. Margaret stopped mid-step. "Well," she murmured, crossing her arms. "You've certainly made yourself at home." The cat blinked. Then, to her utter surprise, it let out a soft chirping sound, almost as if it was greeting her. Margaret tilted her head, studying it. She had lived long enough to know that animals didn't act without reason. They weren't like people, filling the air with meaningless chatter. Every action, every sound had a purpose. "You want me to take it, don't you?" she asked, gesturing toward the mouse. The cat flicked its tail. Margaret sighed, rubbing the bridge of her nose. She wasn't sure why she felt obligated to go along with this little ritual, but she did. Maybe it was the sheer persistence of it, or maybe, deep down, she wanted to see where this led. So, just as she had done yesterday, she bent down, scooped up the tiny creature, and walked toward the garden. The cat followed. Margaret's heart gave a tiny lurch. It had never followed her before. She knelt by the same spot in the flower bed, digging a small hole in the soft earth. As she placed the mouse inside, she glanced sideways at the cat. "You must think I'm ridiculous," she muttered. The cat didn't respond, of course. It just watched. Margaret covered the hole and patted the soil down gently. The wind stirred the leaves above her, carrying the scent of damp earth and blooming lavender. When she stood, the cat rubbed against her leg again, a slow, deliberate movement. Margaret hesitated, then reached down and ran her fingers through its fur. It was warm, soft, purred. Something in her chest softened. "Well," she murmured, more to herself than to the cat. I suppose you're not going anywhere, are you? The cat looked up at her, unblinking. Margaret exhaled. Fine, but if you're staying, you need a name. The cat tilted its head. Margaret thought for a moment, her mind wandering back to the past, to evenings spent on this same porch, but with a different companion. Basil. The name barely left her lips before she realized how right it felt. She hadn't thought about it in years. Basil had been her late husband's favorite herb. He had always insisted on growing it in the garden, swearing it was the secret to making the best homemade tomato sauce. She had never argued, even when he planted too much and ended up drying bunches of it to give away to neighbors. She smiled faintly, shaking her head. Yes, she said, looking at the cat again. Basil suits you. The cat, Basil, didn't react much, but Margaret could have sworn the purring grew a little louder. That night, for the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel the weight of loneliness pressing down on her as she lay in bed. She thought of Basil curled up outside, waiting for morning. And for some reason, that thought made her feel a little lighter. The next few days passed in a routine that felt strangely natural. Every morning, Margaret would find a mouse on her porch. Every morning, she would scoop it up, bury it in the flower bed, and Basil would watch, his tail twitching. And every evening, he would sit beside her on the porch, dozing lazily as she sipped her tea. For the first time in a long while, Margaret had company. But it wasn't until a neighbor stopped by that she realized just how much Basil had become part of her life. "Morning, Margaret," called Mrs. Perkins, a woman from down the road. She was carrying a small basket of fresh eggs from her hens. Margaret waved, smiling. Mrs. Perkins climbed the porch steps, pausing when she spotted Basil sitting beside Margaret's chair. Her eyes widened. "Well, I'll be," she said, setting the basket down. "You've tamed the stray?" Margaret frowned slightly. "Tamed?" Mrs. Perkins nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "That cat's been roaming the neighborhood for years. Never let anyone get near him." She gave Basil a curious look. "But he seems quite comfortable with you." Margaret glanced at the cat, who was grooming his paw lazily. She had assumed he was just another stray. But now, "How long has he been around?" she asked. Mrs. Perkins thought for a moment. "Since old Mr. Thompson passed, I reckon." Margaret's brow furrowed. "Mr. Thompson? The man who lived in that little house by the creek," Mrs. Perkins said. "Passed away a couple of years ago. Didn't have family, just that cat. Stuck by him till the end." A strange feeling settled in Margaret's chest. She looked down at Basil. He had been someone's companion before, someone who was now gone. The idea made her heart ache. Had he been bringing Mr. Thompson gifts before? Had he spent all this time looking for someone new to care for? Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. She reached down and scratched behind Basil's ears. The cat leaned into her touch, purring. "Well," Margaret murmured, "you're home now, Basil." The cat curled his tail around her wrist. Mrs. Perkins smiled knowingly. "Looks like you've got yourself a friend for life." Margaret didn't respond. She was too busy blinking away the sudden sting in her eyes. That evening, when Margaret set down a fresh bowl of food for Basil, she didn't wonder if he would eat it this time. She knew he would. And sure enough, as she sat in her rocking chair and watched the sun dip below the trees, Basil patted over, sniffed the dish, and, after weeks of hesitation, finally ate. Margaret smiled, and for the first time in a long, long while, her heart felt full. The days passed in an easy rhythm, each one blending into the next with the comforting predictability of an old habit. Every morning, Basil left a small offering on the porch. Every morning, Margaret dutifully scooped it up and buried it in the flower bed. And every evening, as the sky melted into streaks of gold and violet, she sat in her rocking chair, a warm cup of tea in hand, while Basil curled up at her feet. She had never expected this, a routine with another living soul. Not after all these years. Margaret had lived alone for so long that solitude had become her shadow, something that followed her so closely that she hardly noticed it anymore. But now, with Basil's quiet presence, she realized just how much space there had been in her life. She no longer ate her breakfast in silence. She spoke softly to Basil as she set down his food bowl. She no longer sat alone on her porch. Basil was always there, his tail flicking lazily as he listened to her stories. One evening, as she ran her fingers absent-mindedly through his fur, she murmured, "You know, I was never much of a talker before." Basil let out a low purr, stretching his paws. Margaret chuckled. "Guess you bring it out of me." She sipped her tea, glancing out at the horizon. The trees swayed gently in the evening breeze, their leaves whispering secrets to one another. She had lived in this house for over 40 years, but tonight, for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like just a spectator to the world outside. She was part of something again. One afternoon, while Margaret was tending to her garden, Basil came trotting toward her, his tail held high. She smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "Come to supervise? Have you?" Basil rubbed against her leg before sitting down. Margaret bent down to pull a few weeds, humming a tune she hadn't thought of in years. The quiet between them was comfortable, the kind of silence that didn't feel empty but full. Then Basil did something unexpected. Instead of watching her from a distance, he jumped into the flower bed, right onto the patch of soil where she had been burying his gifts. Margaret blinked. Basil began pawing at the ground, his claws digging into the dirt. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "What are you doing?" The cat didn't stop. His movements were deliberate, as if he was looking for something. Margaret reached out and touched his back gently, but Basil was focused, his tail twitching with determination. And then, just as suddenly as he had started, he stopped. His paw had uncovered something small and dark in the soil. Margaret leaned in, frowning. It wasn't one of the mice she had buried. It was something else. With slow, careful fingers, she picked up the small object and brushed the dirt away. A ring. Her breath caught in her throat. Not just any ring. Her wedding ring. Margaret stared at it in disbelief. She had lost this ring over 30 years ago. Her hands trembled as she turned it over in her palm. The gold band was worn, the small engraving on the inside barely legible. But she didn't need to read it to know what it said. "Forever, my love, Charles." Margaret felt her chest tighten. 30 years. She had searched everywhere for this ring. It had slipped off her finger while she was gardening one summer, and no matter how much she dug, how much she looked, it had never turned up. She had assumed it was gone forever. Yet here it was, and Basil had found it. She looked at the cat, who was now sitting calmly beside her, watching her with those deep green eyes. A lump formed in her throat. "Oh, Basil," she whispered. Her fingers curled around the ring, clutching it to her chest. Tears pricked at the edges of her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she reached out and scooped Basil into her arms, holding him close. The cat didn't resist. For the first time, he let her hold him, resting his head against her shoulder, his purring deep and steady. Margaret closed her eyes. She had spent so many years believing that the things she had lost, her husband, her ring, the sense of warmth in her home, were gone for good. But Basil had proven her wrong. Maybe some things had a way of coming back when you needed them most. Maybe love, in its own quiet, persistent way, always found its way home. That evening, Margaret did something she hadn't done in decades. She wore her wedding ring. It felt strange at first, the metal cool against her skin. But as she turned it around her finger, she smiled. She hadn't forgotten how it felt to wear it. She just needed a reminder. Basil sat beside her, watching the sky darken, and Margaret stroked his fur absent-mindedly. "Charles would have liked you," she murmured. "He always had a soft spot for strays." Basil flicked his tail. Margaret sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I think you were meant to find me," she said softly. Basil blinked at her, then, ever so gently, placed a paw on her hand. Margaret felt her throat tighten. Yes, she thought, some things were never truly lost. Margaret spent the next few days adjusting to the feeling of the ring on her finger. She turned it absent-mindedly as she went about her daily routines, catching the glint of gold in the sunlight, feeling the comforting weight of it resting against her skin. She found herself speaking to Basil more often, as though he could understand every word. "You know," she said one afternoon, as she set a bowl of food down for him, "I used to think this house would always be too big for just one person." She watched as he sniffed the food before beginning to eat. "But now, it doesn't feel so empty anymore." Basil's tail flicked in response, though whether it was from contentment or simply habit, Margaret didn't know. She settled into her rocking chair, letting the breeze play through her silver hair. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about the past. She was simply here, in the present, sharing a quiet moment with a creature who had somehow become the closest thing to family. That evening, as she sat watching the sun dip below the trees, Basil curled up on her lap. It was the first time he had done so, and the warmth of his small body against her own filled Margaret with something she hadn't realized she'd been missing. A simple, physical reminder that she was not alone. She ran her fingers over his fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. "Good boy, Basil," she murmured. The cat purred in response, pressing his head against her hand. One morning, a knock on the door pulled Margaret from her thoughts. She frowned. It wasn't often that people visited. Setting her tea down, she rose from her chair, moving slowly to the door. When she opened it, she was met with the sight of a young woman. Mid-30s, bright eyes, a kind but hesitant smile. "Mrs. Thompson?" the woman asked. Margaret's brows furrowed. "Yes." The woman glanced past her, spotting Basil perched on the porch railing. A small smile tugged at her lips. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, "but I believe that cat used to belong to my grandfather." Margaret stiffened slightly. She hadn't expected this. The woman shifted, as if sensing her hesitation. "I don't mean to take him away," she added quickly. I wanted to see him. My grandfather, Richard Thompson, he passed a couple of years ago." "That cat," she nodded toward Basil, who was now watching the exchange with quiet curiosity. "His name was Whiskers. He never left my grandfather's side." Margaret felt a familiar ache in her chest. "I know," she said softly. The woman's eyes widened. "You do?" Margaret nodded, glancing down at Basil. "He's been with me for a while now. He's the one who found my wedding ring." The woman let out a breath of surprise. "He never stopped taking care of people," she murmured. Margaret swallowed past the lump in her throat. "He still hasn't." Margaret and the woman, who introduced herself as Claire, sat together on the porch, drinking tea as they talked about Basil's past. Claire told her about how her grandfather had taken in the stray kitten years ago, how the two had been inseparable, how, even after Richard fell ill, Whiskers had never once left his side. "He used to bring my grandfather gifts too," Claire said with a soft chuckle. "Mostly leaves and twigs, but sometimes mice." Margaret smiled. "He still does." Claire laughed, shaking her head. "I should have known he'd find someone else to take care of." Margaret glanced at Basil, who was dozing in his usual spot beside her. "Or maybe he found someone to take care of him." Claire smiled. "Maybe both." They sat in silence for a moment, the breeze carrying the scent of blooming flowers through the air. "I'm glad he found you," Claire said finally. Margaret reached down, running a hand over Basil's back. "I am too." That evening, as Margaret watched Claire drive away, she felt something settle inside her. Not sadness, not longing, just peace. Basil had a past, a history, and now he had a future with her. She looked down at him, smiling. "You're home now, Basil." The cat stretched lazily, blinking up at her. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he placed a paw on her hand. Margaret closed her fingers around his tiny paw, holding it for a moment. For the first time in a long while, she knew some things are never truly lost. The next morning, Margaret woke up to the sound of soft scratching at her front door. She knew who it was before she even pulled herself out of bed. Basil. She smiled as she moved slowly, her joints aching just a little more than usual. Some days were like that, but there was a lightness in her chest that made it easier to move. When she opened the door, Basil sat there, tail curled neatly around his paws, watching her with his familiar patient gaze. "Well, good morning," she murmured, stepping onto the porch. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew and wildflowers. It was the kind of morning Charles would have loved. Basil trotted inside without hesitation, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Margaret chuckled. "You've decided this is your house now, have you?" The cat hopped onto his chair, the chair that used to belong to Charles, the one that had sat empty for years. Margaret's throat tightened, but not in a painful way. She walked to the kitchen, pouring her morning tea. Basil followed, weaving between her legs like he had lived there all his life. She sighed. "Guess I don't have much of a choice, do I?" Basil jumped onto the counter and booped his forehead against her hand. Margaret let out a soft laugh, rubbing between his ears. "All right," she murmured. "I'll admit it. I like having you here," Basil purred, curling up in a sunlit patch on the floor. Margaret sipped her tea. For the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel like the day ahead was just another series of empty hours to pass. That afternoon, Margaret sat in the garden, watching as Basil stalked something in the grass. His tail twitched, his muscles tensed, and then pounce. A moment later, he trotted over. A tiny field mouse clutched between his teeth. Margaret sighed, shaking her head. "Really, Basil?" He placed the mouse at her feet, sitting back proudly. Margaret stared at him, hands on her hips. "You're not giving this up, are you?" Basil blinked, his tail flicking. Margaret chuckled to herself. She reached down, carefully picking up the tiny creature. It was still alive. It wriggled slightly in her hands, its tiny heart beating fast. Basil's ears twitched. Margaret looked between him and the mouse. "You're a good hunter. I'll give you that," she murmured. "But not today." With a gentle motion, she walked to the edge of the yard and let the tiny creature scurry back into the underbrush. When she turned, Basil was watching her, his head tilted slightly. Margaret sighed. I know. You think you're taking care of me." She walked back to where he sat and bent down, stroking his fur. "You are Basil," she whispered. "More than you know." Basil pressed his head against her palm, closing his eyes. And Margaret knew this was exactly where they both belonged. The days slipped by, each one carrying with it a familiar rhythm. Basil's soft footsteps in the morning, the comforting weight of his presence on the porch, the quiet companionship that Margaret hadn't realized she needed until he arrived. But one morning, something was different. Margaret stepped outside as usual, expecting to find Basil waiting for her. But he wasn't there. Her chest tightened. She scanned the yard, the porch, even the small path that led toward the garden. No sign of him. "Basil," she called, her voice catching slightly. Nothing. Margaret felt a familiar fear creeping in, the fear of loss. She had lost too many things in her life. She had learned to move forward, to carry on even when her heart ached. But she wasn't ready to lose him too. She grabbed her shawl and stepped off the porch, her knees protesting the sudden movement. She walked through the garden, calling his name. Still nothing. She made her way toward the back of the house, her heartbeat picking up speed. And then, a soft, familiar meow. Margaret exhaled in relief, following the sound. And there, curled up beneath the large oak tree at the edge of her property, was Basil. But he wasn't alone. Margaret's breath caught. Beside him, nestled in the grass, were 3 tiny kittens. Margaret blinked, her mind trying to process what she was seeing. "Basil," she murmured, stepping closer. "Or should I say, Basilina?" The cat lifted her head and blinked up at Margaret, her green eyes calm, content. Margaret laughed. A deep, full laugh that she hadn't heard from herself in years. "Well," she said, crouching down slowly, ignoring the way her knees protested. "Aren't you full of surprises?" The kittens were so small, their fur barely fluffed out. They wriggled closer to Basil, to their mother. Margaret reached out, running a gentle hand over Basil's head. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt something she hadn't even realized she had been missing. Purpose. Margaret sat on the porch that evening, Basil curled in her lap, the kittens bundled in a small basket beside her. She rocked slowly, watching the stars blink into the darkening sky. Her wedding ring caught the light, a reminder of the life she had lived before, the life she had thought was behind her. But life had a way of surprising you, of bringing you exactly what you needed, even when you didn't know you needed it. She looked down at Basil, scratching behind her ears. "Guess you knew better than I did." "Huh?" she murmured. The cat purred, pressing into her touch. Margaret smiled. She had spent so many years believing that her life had settled into a quiet, inevitable loneliness. But now, as the kittens let out soft squeaks from their basket, as Basil purred against her chest, as the stars twinkled above her, she knew she had been wrong. That night, for the first time in decades, Margaret didn't fall asleep to the sound of silence. She fell asleep to the sound of purring. And it was the most beautiful sound in the world. Margaret hadn't planned on becoming a mother again. Not at her age, not like this. But as she sat on the porch, cradling one of the tiny kittens in her palm, she felt something stir inside her. A warmth, a quiet sort of joy. She watched as Basil curled protectively around her babies, her tail twitching gently as they nursed. The kittens, 3 little bundles of fur, squirmed and stretched, their tiny paws kneading against their mother's belly. Margaret sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Well, this changes things, doesn't it?" she murmured. Basil flicked her ears, but otherwise didn't move. Margaret knew she had to make adjustments. The house wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to Basil and her little ones now, too. She went into the spare room that had sat empty for so many years, the one that used to be her late husband's study. The shelves were still lined with his books, his old armchair sitting in the corner as if waiting for him to return. But now it was time for something new. Margaret set up a small bed for Basil and the kittens, lining it with an old knitted blanket she had made years ago but never used. She placed a shallow bowl of water nearby, along with a dish of soft food for Basil. When she stepped back to look at it, she smiled. It wasn't much, but it was a home. Later that evening, Margaret sat on the floor beside the bed, watching as the kittens slept. Their tiny chests rose and fell with each breath, their little tails curled around themselves. She reached out, brushing her fingertips over one of them. A gray one with a single white paw. A memory surfaced, one she hadn't thought of in years. Her husband, Charles, had always talked about getting another cat. After their first one, Winston, had passed, he had mentioned it often. "We should get another one, Margaret," he had said one afternoon, as they sat on this very porch. A little gray one, just like Winston. Margaret had laughed at the time, shaking her head. "Oh, Charles," she had said, "we're too old to be chasing after kittens." But now, as she looked at the tiny gray kitten with the single white paw, she felt a lump rise in her throat. Maybe Charles had been right. Maybe they hadn't been too old. Maybe she had just been too scared. Margaret exhaled, a slow, steady breath. "Well, Charles," she murmured, "I guess you got your wish." The kitten let out a tiny sigh in its sleep, curling closer to its siblings. Margaret smiled. Maybe some things truly did find their way back to you. Over the next few weeks, Margaret's home transformed. She had spent so many years keeping things exactly the way they had always been, preserving the past, living in quiet solitude. But now, with Basil and her 3 kittens, life moved again, and Margaret moved with it. She found herself doing things she hadn't done in years. She knelt on the floor, playing gently with the kittens, wiggling a piece of yarn in front of them as they batted at it with tiny paws. She found herself laughing, a deep, genuine laugh, whenever one of them stumbled over their own feet, rolling onto their backs with wide, surprised eyes. She started talking to Basil even more, sometimes catching herself telling the cat things she hadn't spoken aloud in years. "You know," she said one morning as she sat by the window, watching the kittens explore their new world, "I used to think this house was too quiet, but now, I don't mind the noise." Basil, stretched out in a sunbeam, flicked her tail in response. Margaret chuckled. "I'll take that as agreement." She had never realized just how much she had missed this. The feeling of something to care for, something to look forward to. And yet, as happy as she felt, she knew the time was coming. The kittens wouldn't stay this small forever. And eventually, they would need homes of their own. One evening, Margaret sat on the porch with Basil curled in her lap. The kittens were finally old enough to climb up onto the porch steps on their own, their tiny claws gripping the wood as they explored. She sighed, stroking Basil's fur. "I suppose I'll need to find them homes soon," she murmured. Basil didn't respond, but Margaret could feel the cat's slow, steady breathing. She had thought about keeping them all, but deep down, she knew she couldn't. It wouldn't be fair. They deserved more than just an old house and an old woman. They deserved families, warmth, and lives filled with adventure. Margaret smiled sadly. Still, the thought of letting them go. She sighed. Not yet. She would hold on for just a little while longer. Just until she was ready. Margaret took her time preparing for the inevitable. She knew she had to find good homes for the kittens, but she refused to rush the process. They had become part of her world, their tiny paw prints marking places in her heart she never thought would feel whole again. She decided to speak with Mrs. Perkins first. The woman had always been kind, always checking in, bringing fresh eggs and bread when she thought Margaret needed them. So one afternoon, Margaret invited her over for tea. "They're beautiful," Mrs. Perkins said, watching the kittens chase each other around the parlor. "I don't know how you plan to let them go." Margaret chuckled softly, sipping her tea. "I don't either." Mrs. Perkins reached down, lifting the gray kitten with the white paw. The tiny thing mewled and stretched its legs, curling into the warmth of her hands. "This one's special," she said. Margaret smiled. "Yes." There was a long pause before Mrs. Perkins finally looked up. "Would you mind if I took her?" Margaret swallowed, her throat tightening. She had known this moment was coming, but it still hit harder than she expected. But she knew Mrs. Perkins would love that kitten. And more importantly, the kitten would be loved. Margaret nodded. "She'd be lucky to have you," Mrs. Perkins beamed. "I'll take good care of her, I promise." Margaret glanced down at Basil, who was watching everything unfold with her steady green eyes. She reached down, scratching behind Basil's ears. "You're right," she murmured. "It's time." Over the next few weeks, the other two kittens found homes. One went to Claire, the young woman who had visited weeks ago, claiming Basil had once belonged to her grandfather. She had fallen in love with the smallest kitten, a feisty little tabby who always seemed to be one step ahead of her siblings. "I think he's got adventure in his blood," Claire had said with a laugh, tucking the tiny creature into the crook of her arm. Margaret agreed. The last kitten, the quietest of the three, went to the local librarian, a woman named Helen who had always had a soft spot for strays. And just like that, Margaret's house became a little quieter. But this time, she didn't mind the quiet. She still had Basil, and that was enough. One evening, as she sat on the porch, watching the stars blink into existence, Margaret felt a deep, unshakable peace. She had spent so much of her life thinking that love was something that only happened once, that once you lost it, it was gone forever. But Basil had taught her something different. Love finds its way back to you, sometimes in ways you never expect. Margaret smiled, running her fingers through Basil's fur. "Yes," she whispered, as the cat purred against her touch. "You were always meant to be here." And for the first time in a long, long while, Margaret knew she was exactly where she was meant to be, too.